Hello and welcome to From Saba to Barbados. It's the Maritime legacy of Eric Hassell. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. Thanks for your time. Last week's program was set in the northeastern Caribbean island of Saba with a sense of purpose. Historians Dr. Henderson Carter, Dr. Tara Ennis, along with Richard Goddard and Mrs. Shirley Chatterton, the daughter of Captain Peace, together they laid the foundation on which this series is built. After a description of the island, we were told of the customs and traditions of the Saban people and what led a number of those Sabans to settle right here in Barbados. They arrive here at this point, the Carinage, and it is from here where Dr. Henderson Carter is standing by to join the discussion. Now, prior to Dr. Carter coming here, he spent countless hours in the Department of Archives researching, and he is standing by around the corner with those statistics. Here's Dr. Carter.
So that by 1915, the Saban population here on this island was about 300. So we have, therefore, the movement, the migration of Sabans and Saban seafarers to Barbados at the beginning of the 20th century.
This is a very tight-knit community, the Saban community that came here. And not only tight-knit with Sabans themselves, but also with the other seafarers and sea captains who were here. So I know that there were very close connections between the Selbys, the Fergusons, the Hassells, and other persons who were participating in that industry in the early 20th century. In fact, I know a number of them decided to kind of their descendants have decided to go and check on Saba and also check on Bequia and St. Vincent, because these are places that they learned about. This was part of their family lore. These are part of the connections that were built up. In terms of the geographic spaces, so Fontebelle and Belleville are well-to-do suburbs of Bridgetown that evolved in the late 19th century. They are segregated spatially. So even though we know that the Hassells settled in Belleville, they didn't necessarily settle in the largest houses available in Belleville. From my understanding, they settled in George Street, which was quite some smaller homes that were not as large and spacious and I guess expensive as some of the other homes in Belleville.
The Averys were one they lived by the church in Belleville. So and seminary for school was there. And Averys, the Sevens, the Best Sevens, and Reverend Sevens, and Love Rocks.
I remember lots of hawkers would always be passing with trays. Especially was intriguing to me was the sound of ball starch. And I was like, what? So she would put her tray down. It would be starch made into balls. She'd have a nice white linen cloth covering it. She would put it on the top step of the front step. And my aunts would come out and buy some starch. Also, there were hawkers selling potatoes, yams, all that stuff. Flying fish and carts. The bread cart, the Purity bread cart would come by, and we would buy turnovers and whatever from the bread cart. Yeah. So yes, that was life in Belleville.
Wow, very different today. Now, back in the 1800s, Belleville was developed as an exclusive residential area in Barbados. Some regarded Belleville back then as the first viable display of good town planning on the island. But Belleville was known for more than its well laid out avenues. In fact, many of us prefer not to speak about what Belleville was widely known for. Mrs. Shirley Chatterton, the daughter of Captain Peace, has memories of life right here in Belleville.
When I would go to my grandparents' house, they would pass by, and I don't remember if they ever came in the house. Now these were white Sabins, right? And they would always shout, and we would speak, but I don't remember ever visiting their home. Yeah, we got friendly after we got adults, but that growing up time, there was more prejudice. Yeah.
Now, what about young Eric Hassell's love for reading and discovery and his very special ability to assimilate information and make wise decisions at such a young age? What about his apprenticeship?
Remember, in Barbados at the beginning of the 20th century, there were issues regarding race and class. And Captain Hassell began his formative years in Belleville. He lived there in Belleville and he was brought up in Belleville. He attended St. Leonard's School. This was an elementary school at the stage located in Baxter's Road. And it is said that he had very little friends because there were certain sections of Belleville where the white middle and upper class did not particularly mix with the colored working class or the black working class. And it is said that sometimes it was very difficult for black people to walk through Belleville. Such was the race class situation at that time. So that Eric, growing up in that area, would not have had many friends. He would not have had many friends, but he kept to his books. He loved reading magazines. He was an avid reader. One magazine called Popular Mechanics. He loved that. And he was a very bright boy. But unfortunately, he did not go on to the secondary level. He did not go on, like most of his peers, to Harrison College or Commermere or the Lodge School in those days. And those were what we call the elite grammar schools of that period. He went into shipping and seafaring at that early age of 11, and that is how he got his education. That is how he got his apprenticeship.
He told me something, and I told it, I mentioned it to Daddy's sister, who is still alive. She's 104 years of age. And Daddy had told me the reason why they sent him to sea at such an early age. And she told me, no, it was not that. Right? And so, I mean, I was not there. All I remember used to tell me that he was in the same class as Dr. Ford.
Dr. Shirley Chatterton, on the other hand, is confident she knows why her dad went to sea at age 11.
The reason his father put him to sea at 11, because his father was put to sea at 10. So, you know, he knew no better. So I think he should have, knowing that, at least forgiven him. But he never forgave him for that. But he learned himself at sea. He was widely read. And he could talk on any subject, really, any subject.
It is important to note that young Eric Hassell was widely read. He read newspapers, he read magazines, he read all available literature. He would find time to read and he enjoyed doing so. It's just one of the components of the life of this quiet man who spoke a few words and derived great pleasure in being at sea.
But the Belleville days were very lonely days. The Belleville area was not the best for a young man, especially a young colored man, to grow up in that area. It was not like in the country, in St. George and in St. Thomas, where boys would be roaming the pasture and playing cricket and playing football, etc. It was a privileged, well-to-do district, Belleville, privileged, well-to-do, a district in which race and class were supreme in terms of how they acted upon that social landscape.
I lived in Belleville as a child. I would say preteen, early teens, and yeah, Belleville was still stratified in the that would have been late 60s, early 70s. There were no gates, but it was pretty much a white community. You know, I would have been seen as, you know, I need to say this. I need to embrace my redness. People would call me red woman, red girl. I was clearly not white, but people do not see me as a black woman, even though I am. But I would be seen as red. So Belleville had its. It was a very interesting community. Some homes you had access to, and some homes you didn't. But I was very focused on my studies. I was going to, part of that time I would have been at Hilltop Prep School. And then part of that time I would have entered what was known as the Girls Foundation School. But I was always an individual who mixed easily with all types of people. I was always very self-confident and self-assured. So the color of one's skin didn't really matter to me. But it was apparent at that time that it was predominantly a white community. And when we look at it today, it is very, very, very diverse, because it is now less residential, more commercial, and other ethnicities have become part of that community.
Now, let us backtrack now to a time when Tassa Chatterton Shaw's grandfather, Eric Hassell, Captain Peace, lived right here in Belleville. Let's continue with his experiences.
So by the 1940s, 1950s, increasingly you're seeing Black Barbadians, middle-class Barbadians, aspiring to be in these spaces as well. So they do become places that are no longer just designated for elite whites and merchants in the city. They are actually starting to be settled by other people. And I know, for example, I think it's the Clarks. The Clarks live in, I think by the 1960s or 70s, the Clarks, a brown family, a middle-class brown family, non-white family, are living in Belleville at the same time. So, yeah, I think just the population dynamics of Barbados weren't conducive to making these racially segregated spaces for long periods of time. But we also know that Sabins, as I said before, they settled in Bay Street and in very humble accommodation, especially if they were seafarers who did not make the rank of sea captain or own ships. These are people who are mingling with, again, with Barbadians who are participating in the same kinds of occupations in the maritime industry.
And with that came a number of associated jobs. For example, there was a need to construct the vessels to transport the cargo across the seas.
Another aspect of that maritime industry was boat building around the west coast of Barbados. For example, at Old Town, schooners were built there. So not all of the schooners were imported from Canada and USA, but some schooners were built at Old Town. For example, the Inavantapul was built at Spicetown, and the Florence M. Douglas, a 105-foot schooner, was also built at Old Town. So we have a culture of boat building in Barbados. But there's also a culture of boat repair in Barbados. And that is why we are here at the famous and the historic Blackwoods Screw Dock. This dry dock, or this dock I should say, this was a very important repair center for many schooners. So schooners would come into this area, the engines would start, and they would turn these screws. The ships and the schooners would be lifted up out of the water, and carpenters and repairmen would scrub the ship. They would paint the ships, and in a week or so, those ships would be ready for ocean-going travel again. So this dock, built in 1887, was a very important center for repair. And during the First World War, the British Navy took control of this dock because of the importance of repairing British ships for the war effort. So a very important and a historic dock, and I would love to see the day when we refurbish this dock and we make it a true historic site.
Absolutely, Dr. Carter. It is the only remaining dry dock of its kind in existence in the entire world. Blackwood Dock stands as a monument to the contribution of Eric Hassell and those individuals who went before him and participated in the maritime trade in Barbados and throughout the Eastern Caribbean. Their legacy is today enshrined in the dock.
So the schooner trade, therefore, was centered around this repair exercise up until about the 1980s when the dock ceased operations.
But if you understood the maritime trade at the time, what Barbados and Bridgetown actually represents a major hub in the early 20th century. So in the age of steam replacing sail, large vessels would come, steam vessels would come to Barbados and then transship their goods onto smaller vessels. And these smaller vessels were captained by Sabins, also Grenadians and Vincentians, etc. And they plied a trade up and down the Leeward and Windward Islands, all the way to South America, to Guyana primarily, and to Curacao and Aruba. And this is what the Sabin captains were involved in, and this is what Eric Hassell's grandparents and families and people that he knew in his community would have been doing for a number of years.
Schooners played a very important role in the maritime culture of Barbados. First of all, schooners were responsible for the trade between Barbados, the Eastern Caribbean, between Barbados and Trinidad, Barbados and Guyana. Now, the question is, what was traded? There are three important items that were traded. First, kerosene oil. Schooners brought kerosene oil from Trinidad. For example, many of the schooners that Captain Hassell, Eric Hassell, and his father Frank, captain or skipper, brought kerosene oil from Trinidad. And most Barbadians use kerosene oil stoves in the 1960s and the 70s. Even up to the 1980s, Barbadians were using kerosene oil stoves. So the gas stove is a recent invention. So that without kerosene oil, many Barbadians would have had to rely on wood. And during the war years between 1939 and 1945, when shipping was difficult because of the presence of German U-boats in this area, the schooner men and the schooner captains took the risk of going to Trinidad to get kerosene oil and coming back and making sure that Barbadians were able to have their food cooked and cooked well with the kerosene oil. Of course, some of those schooners were torpedoed, and in 1942, the Mona Marie was torpedoed a few miles off Barbados, to the southwest of Barbados.
Richard Goddard, in his inimitable style, adds color to his experiences.
Laurie Hassell, he had a schooner, the Mona Marie, and they were sailing from Barbados to Trinidad, and about the watches periscope all left falling them. And about 5 o'clock, the submarine came up. The schooner was 125 feet, and the submarine was 3 times that light. And they machine gunned them, and made them come aboard the submarine and questioned them, and told them to go back on the boat, give them 5 minutes to cut away the sails and not to start a machine gun again. They went and took off the sails and started machine gunning. And one fellow was crying. This fellow asked my uncle to take him a trip from Barbados. He never left Barbados. And the very trip he took him when he was sunk in. And as they're doing away, this man is crying. My uncle said, "Tom, what's happened to you? You got hit too with a machine gun?" He said, "No, I can't. What's wrong with you? I had a new pair of black shoes. I went in London once, and on the schooner, I missed them."
So schooner captains took that risk. Captain Hassell did not have that unfortunate experience. He was able to evade many of the German U-boats during that period. So schooners brought kerosene oil to the country. They also brought rice.
Substantial quantities of rice in bags, right? Like 2,000 or 3,000 bags of rice.
Most of the rice that we consumed, especially during the war years, came from Guyana. And even after the war years, when Captain Hassell used the motorboat, the zipper, rice from British Guyana to Barbados, a very important commodity for Barbadian households. But besides rice and kerosene oil, schooner captains also brought lumber. And that lumber was offloaded up until the 1960s up on the wharf side. So we're talking about pitch pine from Guyana.
Cargoes from Barbados to Guyana and back. Charcoal. We used to have charcoal on the deck. The rice to the bottom, and poles and posts are then chopped up for like firewood and whatnot that people used to use because they didn't have all the electricity in those days.
And that lumber was used to construct many of the chattel houses on this island. It is true now that we have a lot of stone houses being erected, but in the 1950s and 60s, many Barbadians had chattel houses. And even going back earlier to the 19th century, the predominant house for working class Barbadians was the chattel house. And the schooner captains brought that lumber to Barbados and played a very important role.
Quite an interesting observation. Lumber brought over to Barbados from Guyana to construct our chattel houses. Now, what about recreation and transportation? Before the advent of a regional airline, there was the schooner that facilitated the safe passage of people and cargo from Barbados to other islands in the Caribbean island chain.
But schooners were also important for travel. And I'm talking about travel between the Eastern Caribbean, Dominica, and St. Vincent, and St. Lucia to Barbados. And many people who traveled were hawkers and hucksters. They came here with their dasheen, they came here with their mangoes, they came here with their limes, they came here with their fruits. And they did a thriving trade along Cheapside and along Broad Street, in Swan Street as well. These hawkers from the Eastern Caribbean, some of them settled here and put up roots here in Barbados. So the schooners brought these people and brought their cargo here to Barbados. Now, in terms of alleviating poverty, therefore, we can say that the schooners were essential to the development of Barbados, especially in hard times. And I'm talking about the period before the 1937 rebellion, when conditions were hard, people were hungry. The schooner men played an important role. It is said that throughout the Eastern Caribbean, schooners would call at the ports, and there were people who would come out of the hills and come out of their areas, and they would bring their sheep and their goat to be traded in places like Trinidad and British Guyana. And the schooner captains would take on these animals on board, for trade, and of course when they get back to the islands, they compensated the persons who produced the animals. So schooner traffic was important, therefore.
Well, thank you, Dr. Carter. All of the records indicate that it was important indeed. Well, that brings us to the end of this, the second program in the current series of From Saba to Barbados, the maritime legacy of Captain Eric Hassell. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. As always, thanks for your time. I look forward to having you with me again next week. Until then, Nix, goodbye for now.